March 22, 1994. Aeroflot Flight 593, one of the many planes part of the Russian state-owned fleet, is en route from Moscow to Hijacked Airport in Hong Kong. At 0:55, the 12 crew members and 63 passengers are flying above the snowy peaks of the Kuznetsk-Alatau mountain chain. The journey has been nothing but smooth and comfortable for everybody on board thus far. Little did anyone know, one simple mistake, a single breaking of safety protocol, would lead to the plane crashing into a fiery wreck on the mountainside just 4 minutes later, killing everyone on board. This is the story of how one man's desire to please his family led to one of the most tragic disasters in Russian history. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially collapsed, marking the end of the Cold War. America had emerged as the clear victor, but the government of the newly established Russian Federation had no plans on staying beaten on the ground for long. Aeroflot had long operated as the official airliner for the USSR throughout the country's lifespan. In 1992, it opened its doors to the world to cement both itself and the Russian Federation as a modern, international force to be reckoned with. Gone were the days of Russian companies being associated with cheap products and poor service. The higher-ups at Aeroflot were dead set on redefining the airline as a comfortable and elite experience, whose planes were manned by only the very best crew and pilots. By 1994, it looked as if their vision had become a reality. They had highly experienced Russian pilots in charge of every flight, flew to exotic locations across the world, and even operated top-of-the-range Western Airbus A310-304 models. This was certainly the case of Flight 593, a 13-hour route from Moscow to Hong Kong, which passed over the frigid Siberian wilderness. Aeroflot had assigned the best of the best to oversee the journey, 3 pilots who had built distinguished careers during the Soviet era. The captain, Andrei Viktorovich Danilov, is 40 years old and has just under 10,000 recorded hours of flight time, including 950 hours of experience with new Airbus models. The first officer, Igor Vasilyevich Piskarev, is 33 years old and has over 5,000 hours of recorded flight time. The relief captain, Yaroslav Vladimirovich Kudrinsky, is 39 years old and has nearly 9,000 hours of total flight time under his belt. It's the relief captain's job to take over from the captain should they need to rest. Considering the flight is 13 hours long, he obviously will need to do so a fair bit. All of this experience doesn't include the training that each of the pilots have received regarding the actual journey from Moscow to Hong Kong itself. In short, Aeroflot could not have picked more seasoned veterans of the Russian aviation industry. If anything did go wrong, nobody on the planet seemed more qualified than these 3 pilots to handle the situation. Before takeoff, the crew all check upcoming weather patterns to make sure there are no nasty surprises lying in wait for them during the journey. Everything looks good. They run a few more checks on the aircraft, see no problems, and so, at 20:39, the plane takes off without a hitch and is firmly en route towards Hong Kong with all 63 passengers on board. Along with the 3 in charge of Flight 593 is another pilot in the cockpit, Vladimir Makarov, who's deadheading. This just means he's traveling on board as a passenger, with no formal authority over the operations of the plane to get to a closer destination to his next stop. The first 4 hours are smooth sailing, but the pilot needs some sleep. At around 0:26, Danilov gets up from his seat and passes control to the relief captain, Kudrinsky. Of the 63 passengers on board, 2 are more important than the others. This is because they're Kudrinsky's son, Eldar, and his daughter, Yana, 16 and 13 respectively. Kudrinsky is proud of his distinguished career, and for good reason. So, he wants to show off his hard work to his children. He invites them into the cockpit to have a look around. This might strike you as strange today, as the door to the cockpit on modern planes is kept firmly shut. But before the September 11th terrorist attacks, bringing a child into the cockpit to see how the plane operated as a treat was common procedure. Eldar and Yana move up through the aisle towards the cockpit, open the door, and slip inside to see how their father makes all the magic happen. Only 30 minutes later, they, and everyone else on board, would be dead. At around 0:30, the cockpit is occupied by the relief captain, now in charge of the plane, his two children, the first officer, and the deadheading pilot. The cockpit of a modern airliner truly is a marvel of human engineering, with hundreds of flashing lights, buttons, and displays that give the pilots all the information they need to keep the plane flying smoothly. It looks like the command center of an alien spaceship to the average layman. Making any sense of the array of buttons at all requires many years of study and experience, so nobody wants anyone but the most seasoned pilots operating the controls. Still, at the time, Kudrinsky had not yet violated any major safety protocols by allowing his children into the cockpit. They could explore the inside and marvel at the systems to their heart's content, as long as they didn't actually touch anything. So, this is exactly what they do, and Kudrinsky feels his heart swell with pride, watching his two children looking around the cockpit, eyes wide with curiosity. This is when a very, very bad idea comes to his mind. Kudrinsky wants to offer his kids the very best experience possible, something that no other child at their schools could boast of doing. He gives them the chance to fly the plane themselves. If this sounds insane to you, that's because it is. Under no circumstances are the controls of a plane allowed to be passed over to someone with no prior experience, let alone children that haven't even graduated from high school. In fact, the pilot in command of the flight at the time isn't even allowed to exit the pilot chair unless he has relinquished command to another member in the cockpit, such as a relief captain or first officer. It's a major violation of safety procedures in every possible sense. But Kudrinsky figures it's worth bending the rules for a few short minutes to give his children an experience they would never forget. He stands up and invites his 13-year-old daughter, Yana, to sit down in the pilot's chair. First Officer Piskarev should intervene at this moment and remind the relief captain that such a thing is strictly forbidden. But he remains silent. Yana sits down in her father's seat, heart full of wonder. The yoke, a wheel-like device used to steer the plane, stands before her. Kudrinsky stands behind the chair and says to his daughter,
"Go ahead, take the controls."
To his credit, Kudrinsky is not completely clueless. He understands that giving his daughter full control of a massive plane filled with 63 passengers mid-flight is probably not the safest idea. While Yana has her hands on the yoke, the autopilot is switched on, meaning she has no real control of the plane. Yana turns the yoke slightly to the left so Kudrinsky reaches above his head and adjusts the autopilot heading bug 15 degrees to the left. This tells the autopilot to induce a slight bank to the left, which tilts the plane slightly to its left side and gives Yana the impression that she's actually steering the plane herself. Once she brings the yoke back to center, Kudrinsky adjusts the heading bug again and the plane stabilizes. It's important to note that even though Yana has her hands on the yoke, she's not exerting any real pressure on the wheel itself. No inputs are being put into the controls that could modify the plane's trajectory in any way. At 0:51, Yana stands up from the pilot's seat, proud of herself, and gives way to her brother, Eldar. Eldar sits down in his father's chair and takes in the sights too. Makarov, the deadheading pilot, suggests they take a picture of the 16-year-old so he can show all his friends back in Russia. Eldar would sadly never go home. Kudrinsky does the same thing with his son as he did with his daughter. As Eldar turns the yoke to bank right, he adjusts the heading bug accordingly, and the plane responds. This time, however, things are different. Unlike Yana, Eldar actually does put pressure on the wheel to turn it. The autopilot is designed to maintain control until it reaches the designated degree of tilt indicated by Kudrinsky. But if the pilot exerts enough force on the yoke, the autopilot gives way and enables manual control. Even though the plane has tilted enough to account for Kudrinski's orders, it feels Eldar continue to push, so relinquishes control. A light switches on to indicate the autopilot disconnect, but the A310-304 model is different from the others at the time. First, it only relinquishes lateral control, meaning how much the plane can tilt on its side, rather than disconnecting fully. Second, it doesn't let out any audible warning, which the pilots were used to in Soviet models. Eldar is in full control of the plane for 20 whole seconds and is unknowingly pushing it to continue turning. The pilots are distracted at the time and don't notice what's going on until Eldar speaks up.
"Why is it turning?"
he asks sheepishly. A cold chill runs down Kudrinski's spine as he realizes the magnitude of what he's just done. The time is 0:55, and Flight 593 is passing over the Kuznetsk-Alatau Mountains. Because of Eldar's inputs, the plane is now tilting more and more to one side, and the autopilot has switched off. All 75 people on board are heading towards disaster. Makarov points out to the other pilots from his jump seat that the plane is tilting towards the holding area. First Officer Piskarev looks down at his monitors and confirms as much. In aviation, holding is when a plane flies in a circular pattern in a designated area at a steady altitude. This is often done when waiting for the runway to clear. The holding area is an oval shape on the pilot's screens that indicates how much tilt is needed to make the necessary turns. Tilting the plane to the holding area is never done mid-flight when there are no complications. The pilots are confused by this, as they believe the autopilot is still operating and has corrected the plane's bank. Just 9 seconds later, the plane tilts to an almost 90-degree angle, causing it to lose altitude rapidly. Flight 593 is heading towards the ground fast. The crew in the cockpit had no idea that the autopilot aileron controls would deactivate when faced with enough pressure, so they're caught completely off guard. But there's still time for them to salvage the situation. All they need to do is let go of the rudder. Eldar needs to bring the yoke back to the resting position at the center. His father and the first officer scream at him,
Hold the rudder!
Meaning they want him to let go of the controls. To an untrained layman, however, it sounds like they want him to keep pushing the yoke to the right. So he does just that. This pilot's mistake ends up costing them valuable time. Before Kudrinski can pull his son out of the pilot's seat, the plane is subjected to an immense amount of G-force, making it nearly impossible for anyone to move. The autopilot attempts to fix the situation by lifting the nose and increasing thrust. This throws the plane into a stall, and the autopilot switches off for good. The plane tips into a nosedive, but the reduced G-force allows Kudrinski to take back his seat. The relief captain pulls up to regain control and succeeds, but he puts in too much power, so he sends the plane up vertically and back into a stall. Finally, Kudrinski manages to pull out of the spin, level the plane out from its near 90-degree bank, and regain some control of the situation. It's too little, too late, however. The plane has been hurtling towards the ground at a speed of over 200 meters per second. Even after stabilizing the plane and slowing its descent, Kudrinski simply doesn't have enough room to bring them back up to safety. Flight 593 falls from the sky and crashes into the Kuznetsk-Alatau mountain chain. The plane bursts into flames upon impact, leaving nothing but a terrible scar across the snowy mountainside and a fiery wreck in its wake. All 75 people on board, including Kudrinski's 2 children, die. Air traffic control at Novokuznetsk, an airport where Flight 593 was meant to stop over on its way to Hong Kong, wait for over 2 hours with their hearts in their throats for any response from the plane. Every time they try to make a connection, they're met by a terrifying silence. Finally, reports of burning wreckage along the mountainside come through to the command center, and reality sets in. The tragedy leaves millions across both Russia and the entire world heartbroken. It's a massive blow to Aeroflot and the Russian Federation's reputation. Their dreams of reinventing themselves as modern players on the world stage are left in the dust after the disaster. Another Aeroflot crash had occurred only 8 years prior, where the pilots bet that they could land the plane blind. The mark of low quality and incompetence left behind by the USSR had hardly been erased. When the news initially reaches the public's ears, Aeroflot assures everyone that the pilots did everything in their power to prevent the crash, and that the accident was entirely out of their control. Rumors are circulating that children were left to take control of the plane, but the airline calls these slanderous lies to discredit the company. What they fail to mention is that they've listened to the black box recording of the flight's last moments and know for a fact that Captain Kudrinsky did let his children sit in the pilot's seat and control the plane. Hiding the truth forever is an impossible feat, however, and soon a magazine by the name of Obozrevitel breaks the news that the pilot did indeed let his children steer the plane mid-flight. The tragic crash of Aeroflot Flight 593 has lingered as a dark stain over the Russian aviation industry for many years. Many remain baffled by how a pilot so experienced could be so unprofessional, reckless, and foolish. His desire to please his family and show off his work ultimately cost them their lives, and the lives of 72 other people on board. Makarov was not in a position of authority over the plane at the time, as he was merely a passenger. First Officer Piskarev should have spoken up and turned the children away from the controls when they first sat down in the pilot's chair, but ultimately, the responsibility falls on the acting captain of the plane, Kudrinsky. The families of those who fell victim to Kudrinsky's recklessness laid flowers and farewell messages across the ground where the plane had crashed. Thankfully, rules on who is allowed in the cockpit at any time during the flight are much stricter today than they were in 1994. The fate of Flight 593 is a lesson in how deadly skirting the rules and being reckless in positions of power can truly be. Hopefully, a tragedy of its like never occurs again.